I'm going to speak to you about the Irish horticultural sector, and mainly, although Irish horticulture in general is considered to be quite a sustainable and probably the most sustainable form of food production, like every sector, it has its challenges. And I suppose one of the main challenges we have in the next 10 to 15 years is transitioning away from peat as a growth media and into other alternative materials. So as some context, I'd like to describe the horticulture sector in Ireland is the fourth largest agricultural sector, valued just over at 450 million euros farm gate value. It supports about 6,500 full-time workers in primary production and about another 11,000 people in downstream businesses. Approximately 60% of the value of Irish horticulture is dependent on peat. So that includes key production areas such as mushrooms, hardy nursery stock, vegetables, and ornamental plant modules and vegetable plant modules. But also, if you take growth media to encompass more than just peat, key sectors such as soft fruit are also dependent on growth media. So internationally, we estimate that demand for growth media is going to increase by 400% up to 2050. So while most of that increase in demand will come from Asia and Africa as they transition, I suppose, out of soil and into hydroponic systems, even in Europe, we're estimating by 2050, you're going to see an increase from 35 million meter cubed of material required up to about 70 million meter cubed of material. So in terms of growth media, why do we use peat? Well, peat is a fantastic growth media. It's a great material. It is stable. It doesn't reduce in volume. It has a low bulk density, which really means it has a large volume for a low weight, which makes it very favorable to use in terms of machinery and also to transport it. Unlike other materials that sometimes are reported to replace peat, it has a very good moisture retentive capability. So it retains and releases moisture very well in a predictive manner, in a manner that other materials don't tend to do. And I suppose largely from an Irish context, it was very available and available at a low cost. So in terms of peat use in professional horticulture, these are just figures, from 2018, was about 3% of the peat extracted in 2018. So that equated to about 380,000 meter cubed. So that compares, say, with something, the peat extracted for energy production, which would be somewhere around 9 million meter cubed that year. So of that material, about 60% of it goes to mushroom production, both on Irish farms in Ireland and in Irish-owned farms in the UK. And about 40% of it then goes into professional horticulture, such as in nursery stock and in raising young plants. It's estimated that the amateur horticulture market needs about 470,000 meter cubed of material a year for the amateur sector, and that the requirement in Northern Ireland is about 150,000 meter cubed. So that lands us somewhere in a figure of a need on the island of Ireland of about 1 million meter cubed of growth media per year. So there are various strategies, I suppose, or ambitions across Europe to replace peat in the professional horticultural sector. And while we don't have any use-up dates or target dates currently in Ireland, if you take countries such as in the UK, their figures are likely to be phasing out peat use from 2028 to 2030. Or if we take maybe some countries such as Holland, where they're phasing out peat use over a longer period, but a lot of that phasing out will happen before 2035. We're really looking at, in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to have to make some significant reductions in peat use in the professional horticultural sector. So in 2022, the Department of Agriculture and DERA in Northern Ireland funded a project called Beyond Peat. Beyond Peat is led by Teagasc and has 5 research partners. The aim of Beyond Peat is to assess current alternatives to peat and assess the impact of peat reduction from an agronomic and economic and environmental perspective on the Irish horticultural sector. I suppose an ambition of Beyond Peat is also to look, can we use materials available on the island of Ireland to replace peat? So often there's 4 materials suggested as peat alternatives. They are coir, wood bark, wood fibre, and composted waste. So our Irish horticulture has always had a native source of growth media. And I suppose the ambition of the project is to try and see if we can retain that or continue that. And finally, everything that is created on the project will be exposed to a life cycle assessment. And really that's coming from the perspective that we have to ensure that any materials that we replace peat with are sustainable and have the right environmental credentials. But also we have to understand that you can't just take peat out of current production systems and replace it with another material and not understand that we will probably have to change the irrigation strategies, fertigation strategies, crop protection strategies. So there's a whole, I suppose, line of learning that has to happen beyond when we actually identify some alternative materials. So within the project, the first pillar, as I mentioned, is about evaluating current alternatives. So what we're doing is working with our stakeholders in the growing media sector and in professional growers to identify materials and blends and composts that they've used that they feel may have had performed well and have good potential to replace peat. And we're going to do this across 5 key sectors. That's the mushroom production sector, soft fruit, nursery stock, bedding, and in the production of plant modules for vegetable production. And they'll be assessed from a perspective of yield, quality, and the economic impact of using the material. And while this work has just started, we've noticed a couple of key traits already coming through. So one of the key things that we need from peat, or we like from peat, particularly if I describe it in the context of mushroom production, is peat is very good at retaining moisture, and we can often get moisture levels above 85%, which is critical because the mushrooms themselves have a water content of about 85%. But as you can see on the graph to the left, what we're noticing is that in the non-peat alternatives, they're really struggling to get moisture contents of above 70%. So again, that's one of our first key challenges, is identifying materials that have the ability to retain moisture, at least as well as peat. Another challenge we have is around the area of consistency and reliability. So we've done a couple of studies looking at wood-based alternatives to peat in the mushroom sector, and we've had inconsistent results. So some crops, these wood-based materials have performed very well and given us very good mushroom production. And in other crops, we've had complete losses of the first flush where they just haven't formed. So again, that inconsistency would be a real problem in a commercial production facility. What we're also noticing is, and not unsurprisingly, is as we use composted wastes and other biomass materials, we're getting contamination with other organisms. So on the left here, we see coprinus mushrooms growing, and these are mushrooms that grow typically on decomposing wood. And again, while not a huge challenge, they can release spores, and those black spores can cause tarnishing on the developing mushrooms. We also have to be cognizant that we can't engineer in new problems, particularly problems that might challenge us trying to comply with other EU regulations, such as in the Green Deal. We're looking to reduce the use and risk of pesticides, or suggested that we will, by 50%. So again, we don't want to be engineering in materials that may support and proliferate the occurrence of diseases and other problems. So one of the challenges we have on the project is that, as I said, of the often cited replacements for peat, coir, wood fibres, bark, composted wastes, a lot of those materials that are produced on the island of Ireland are currently at capacity. So they're actually being used to the full extent that they're available. So part of the challenge for our project is to identify other biomasses that are underutilized. So we're currently looking at things such as clay materials, wood fibres, green wastes, wood wastes, quarry washings, etc., to see if we can identify those materials that may have some positive attributes. So we're looking at their physical and chemical characteristics, and then we're trying to assess how much of these materials in a growing media could we use. So if we take a material maybe that has poor moisture retention capacity, we might only be able to use 10, 15, 20% of that material in a compost blend. If we take a material that has a high EC level, we might only be able to use 5% of it in a compost blend. So we kind of have to assess the characteristics of the material and how realistic it is to put it into a growing media. And then we have other scenarios we have to think about. We have to think about cost. Cost is always important in commercial production. We need to look about the future availability of the material and really the bioeconomy context. So again, spent grains are often used in peat alternatives as growing media, but there is an awful lot of research going on to see if those materials can be valorized up into food materials. So again, we have to be careful that when we're looking at materials that we understand the wider research space and where these materials may end up, particularly if they're going towards maybe higher value markets. So when we identify these other sources of biomass on the island, we have to try and figure out how do we process or turn them into a growth medium. And we have 3 strategies to do that. The first one is quite a simple one. It's looking at composting and co-composting. But we're very much focusing on composting single materials. So again, maybe moving away from trying to compost very heterogeneous wastes, green wastes, and more focusing on single wastes, such as maybe from the arable sector, maybe waste grass from the amenity sector. The strategy behind that really is that we're trying to strip out some of the complexity, and again, trying to make these materials more predictable and more consistent, which is again key when you're talking about professional horticultural growing. We may have to use things like compost microbial inoculants to get a good composting process going, and that work is being led by AFBI in Northern Ireland. We're also looking at ways of transforming particularly woody wastes into growing media. So again, biochar is a material produced by pyrolysis, and there is a lot of research that has gone on biochar and growth media, and it's been very inconsistent. There's as many positive stories as negative stories in the literature. What we want to do with this is actually define a kind of an Irish recipe for biochar. So to identify woody biomass that's available consistently on the island of Ireland and is subjected to consistent temperature and a consistent retention time within the process, and optimize that, and then optimize the output of the biochar that's output from the material, and trying to add it to growing media at different levels to see if we can optimize the amount of this material we put into a growth media. So we're also very interested in a process called hydrochar. The reason for that is that the chars from the hydrochar process typically have physical characteristics very similar to peat, which is something that a lot of materials we don't have. Also, the hydrochar process, so that's where material is heated to 200 or 300 degrees in the presence of water. That process itself has a tendency to reduce the EC. So EC is electrical conductivity, or basically the salt content of a material. And again, in a lot of waste materials or biomasses, in Ireland, they tend to have high EC levels. So again, a process that can reduce the EC levels opens up a whole myriad of other materials that we may be able to utilize as growth media. Finally, we're also very interested in seeing, can we combine biodegradable polymers, such as material from the anaerobic digestion process, plant-based fibers, and if we can combine them with things such as polylactic acids and thermoplastic starches. The reason we're trying to do that is, well, we want to see if we can form structures that can retain water and that can be used as anchor for plant roots to grow plants. Again, very much in this area, we're focusing on the very difficult areas where it will be to replace peat, such as in the raising of young plants, modular plants. So again, that's very much of the focus of this kind of work, is to see, can we consistently raise young plants? And again, that's critical, because if you're planting 100,000, 200,000 plants into a field, you need them to all be at the same developmental stage. You need them to all be very consistent in how they're going to grow. Therefore, that makes typically you're growing all your inputs. It allows you to better plan your inputs, and also allows you to better plan your harvesting. So again, it is critical that everything is growing in a consistent and predictable way. As I've mentioned, everything that we're doing in terms of the materials and processes we're looking at, the ones that are most likely to replace peat will be subjected to life cycle analysis. And again, as I mentioned, the reason for this is we have to be sure that these materials will be considered appropriate for this use for the years to come. As an example, when we started using peat in the 1970s in Ireland, it really took 40 years of research up until the 2000s for us to optimize the use of peat, the blends, the vertigation strategies, the irrigation strategies for the dozens and dozens of crops that we have in horticulture. So again, it is a huge investment in time and relearning that we're going to have to go through. So we need to be certain that the materials will be consistent into the future. So to summarize, the widespread replacement of peat in professional horticulture is a massive challenge. We need to identify materials, and in many production cases, we haven't identified full replacements. There are some partial replacements that we are beginning to identify, but in terms of complete replacement of peat, we're not there yet in most sectors. But once we do get there, we do need to be certain that we have sufficient volumes and quantities of the biomasses available in order to service the sector. Where we have developed alternatives to peat, such as partial dilutions in the nursery stock sector, such as the use of coir in the soft fruit sector, those sectors have largely adopted them very quickly. So again, if we can produce and identify these materials, the professional sector has already shown that they will adopt them quite quickly. But I think we always need to be cognizant that there are low margins in the horticultural sector. So this will be key when it comes to potential replacements. Potential replacements need to be economically viable themselves, but they also need to protect yields, so their use cannot reduce yields or quality, because the margins are not within the current production practices to accommodate this. So thank you very much.